Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. My name is Anne-Sophie Corbeau, and I am a Global Research Scholar at the Center on Global Energy Policy at Columbia SIPA. Today we are going to discuss how biohydrogen can help fight climate change. Today's presentation is largely based on one of our recent reports that you can find on our website, The Potential Role of Biohydrogen in Creating a Net Zero World. This event is webcast live, and the full video will be available online in the coming days. For those of you joining us via Zoom, you can submit a question for the panelists at any time by clicking on the Q&A button. All our events are closed captioned, so you can also turn the captions on by clicking the live transcript button at the bottom of your screen and then selecting Show Subtitle. I'm absolutely delighted to be joined today by two of my colleagues who are the main authors of the report, Yushan Lu and Fan. And Yushan is going to present the main findings of the report. We are also delighted to be joined by two external panelists, Doris Fujin, who is the head of hydrogen and CCS analysis at BP, as well as Emanuele Bianco, who is a policy analyst at IRENA. I am now going to turn the floor to Yushan, who is going to deliver the key findings of our report. Yushan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Anne-Sophie, for the introduction. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. To kick off our presentation, let's begin with the basics. What exactly is biohydrogen? Well, it's a special type of hydrogen that is made through the biological or thermochemical conversion of biomass. It is chemically identical to green and blue hydrogen, and I am certain that many of you have heard of or at least seen those buzzwords in the news over the past few years. Biohydrogen is However, biohydrogen is truly unique in its own right and deserves a separate dialogue, mainly due to its potential to have a negative carbon footprint. I will get into why being carbon negative is very good later in the presentation. But for those who are not so familiar with the subject, hydrogen produced from water electrolysis using renewable electricity is typically regarded as green hydrogen. And hydrogen produced from natural gas with carbon capture and sequestration is usually called blue hydrogen. These two types of hydrogen can have a fairly low carbon footprint, somewhere between as low as 0.5 to 5 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen. Because of the urgent need to lower our global carbon footprint, low carbon hydrogen has emerged lately as an important tool that has the potential to decarbonize many sectors of the economy. However, they are incapable of achieving a negative carbon footprint. This is because both electrolyzers and renewable electricities used for green hydrogen production carry some inherent emission footprint, and carbon capture units can only achieve 90% capture rate. So there will always be some residual emission left for green or blue hydrogen. However, biohydrogen is different. It can potentially have a negative carbon footprint if waste biomass is used as feedstock. Then our carbon capture system is deployed during the conversion of biomass to hydrogen. This is particularly important in the context of climate change, as we are looking for new ways to decarbonize. But there's one problem. Biohydrogen is not always carbon negative. Its carbon footprint is highly dependent on how it is produced. So in the next slide, I will talk about all sorts of methods biohydrogen can be made. Biohydrogen production can be a quite complex topic because it can be made from many different types of feedstock through a very diverse range of technologies. This means that biohydrogen's carbon footprint can vary a lot depending on what feedstock and what production process is used. So we really need to pick the right feedstock and the right production technology to make sure that the carbon negativity can happen. I will explain different options for production, biohydrogen production using the figure shown on the slide. Our team has summarized all of the possible routes for biohydrogen production in this figure. And from left to right, we have biomass feedstock, production pathways, followed with the end product on the right. And let's first look at the biomass feedstock on the left column, which are separated into 4 major groups. The first one is lignocellulosic biomass, which is basically a fancy word for anything that's woody based, such as wood pellets. Next is energy crops, which includes sugar or starch crops such as corn, sugarcane, or maize. Then we have waste, which includes municipal solid waste, forest residues, or sewage sludge. And then the last group is quite different from the other 3, which describes a group of microbes that can split water into hydrogen and oxygen directly using sunlight without involving any organic matters. And for our study, we only focus on woody biomass and waste because the use of energy crop has been a quite controversial topic due to uncertainties on its carbon footprint and environmental impact. And the photosynthetic microbes are also excluded because they remain in lab stage and are still far from being commercially ready. Here I want to introduce 2 key concepts when we're evaluating different types of biomass feedstock. The first one is LCA, which stands for Life Cycle Assessment. It evaluates the environmental impact and carbon footprint of a product from its origin to its final disposal. So there are process-based emissions that are oftentimes overlooked. To give you some example, there is emissions from the extraction of raw materials and emissions from the transport of the material from the extraction site to the factory. The next concept is land use change, LUC. It describes the emissions that are generated as a result of replacing original biomass grown on land with biomass used for energy production. This conversion of land will lead to degradation, which releases carbon. And for this particular presentation, we want to make sure that we're only advocating for the use of waste biomass as a source of biohydrogen production, because this type of biomass has both a low LCA and a low LUC. This is very important in the context of climate change because the value of biohydrogen can provide is directly linked to the LCA and the LUC of its feedstock. And moving to the right, we included 6 major conversion pathways. The top 3, gasification, pyrolysis, methane reforming, are all thermochemical processes, meaning that it uses heat in a controlled environment with or without oxygen during the conversion process. The bottom 3 are biological conversion routes, which uses bacteria's natural metabolism to convert biomass into other products. The production technology is very important to understand here because to make carbon negative biohydrogen, it is reliant on the use of CCS. I will talk more about this later, but not all production technologies are CCS compatible. And moving to the right column, in the past, many of these pathways have been used, but they are not dedicated for biohydrogen production. They're mainly for biofuels or biomethane production or for generating heat or electricity directly. Biohydrogen could be produced in the past as a byproduct, but a dedicated biohydrogen production facility can improve the efficiency and produce biohydrogen as the main final product. So I talked briefly about the different technology pathways that can produce biohydrogen. This figure demonstrates the technology readiness level of different production pathways for manufacturing biohydrogen. The system called TRL is used to measure technology maturity of a given technology using a scale from 1 to 9. And the higher the number, the more mature the technology is, and the closer it is to a full-scale commercialization. In general, thermochemical processes are far more advanced than biological processes. Except for dark fermentation, biological pathways remain pretty low on the TRL scale. And one of the biggest problems they have is that they have a low volumetric and substrate specific yield. So it's very difficult to scale. Therefore, if we want to have industry scale biohydrogen production in the short-term horizon, it's more likely that we will be able to achieve that with some thermochemical pathways. So now we have gone over the different type of biomass, different type of production pathways, and their respective technical maturity. We can also compare them using metrics such as cost and carbon footprint. We have compiled results from dozens of studies on biohydrogen production, and both the cost and carbon footprint for biohydrogen production can vary significantly depending on the technology used. I've already mentioned a little bit about carbon footprint earlier, but the cost here, you can see it's it can vary anywhere from 1.4 to 10.5. It is very sensitive to technology's maturity, the availability of infrastructure support, and feedstock. If you take a look at this table, even for the same technology, for instance, gasification, we see that the reported cost for 1 kilogram of hydrogen can range from $1.4 to 10.31. And this wide range of reported value is quite consistent across technologies. If we look at the second column, carbon footprint, I mentioned that in one of the earlier slides that biohydrogen can have a profile of carbon emissions. And in this table, we see a wide range of reported values ranging from -26 to 10 kilogram of CO2 per kilogram of hydrogen produced. And even with the same production method, the footprint can still vary greatly depending on what feedstock is used. Here, I want to point out some deeply negative carbon values we see here, such as -22 for gasification, -13 for pyrolysis, and -26.5 for biomethane SMR or ATR. They're all results of deploying carbon capture technologies. So the carbon negative potential of biohydrogen is only achievable under two conditions. One, the biomass used has as a feedstock has a very low carbon footprint. Two, the technology used is compatible for production is compatible with CCS. And right now, only thermochemical pathways are CCS compatible. As you can see in this table, we have only included an assessment for carbon footprint with CCS for gasification and biomethane SMR or ATR. Pyrolysis can yield in biochar, which is carbon in solid form. And if the biochar is disposed properly or treated properly, it could potentially consider as a CCS. To give you an example of how carbon footprint of the biomass could have an impact on the biohydrogen's final footprint, this graph shows the differences of carbon intensity for biohydrogen made from woody biomass using gasification technology under different LCA and LUC scenario. You can see that LUC, colored in dark blue, has a much higher uncertainty in comparison to LCA. And although both LCA and LUC adds to biohydrogen's emission, incorporating carbon capture can still enable a net negative emission, even in the worst LCA and LUC scenario. This figure looks quite similar to the previous one, but it's a little bit different. It summarizes the carbon intensity of biohydrogen made using waste, such as agricultural residues or forest waste instead of woody biomass. Compared to the previous figure, this waste biomass has a very low LUC, and this type of biohydrogen production can have a near zero carbon footprint even without CCS. And if combined with CCS, you can have a greatly negative carbon footprint. So I've talked about biohydrogen, carbon negative biohydrogen, but why is it important? So I think here it comes the most important piece of the information of this presentation. Carbon negative biohydrogen's greatest advantage, in my opinion, its ability to remove carbon while still providing energy service. So for hard to abate sectors with limited decarbonization opportunities, using this type of hydrogen can compensate for residual emissions that remain after we exhaust other options. For example, the steel industry is very, very carbon intensive. BF-BOF stands for blast furnace-based oxygen furnace. It is the most common method for steel production, accounting for more than 70% of steel made globally. Most of the emissions of BF-BOF in the production process come from blast furnace, which consumes coal, not only as a fuel, but also for hot air blast. And electricity, however, in this case, only accounts for about 13% of its total emission. So using renewable electricity can only play a small part in decarbonizing this process. And even adopting green hydrogen in the production process will still only produce limited results, because this production process still require the use of a coal as a reducing agent. With carbon negative hydrogen, the carbon intensity is actually able to cut in half. Another example is hydrogen's use in the chemical production. Ammonia, methanol, and ethylene are three major primary chemical products, and all of them use hydrogen as feedstock. In a traditional SMR-based ammonia production, it first produces hydrogen using methane, and then combine that hydrogen with nitrogen to form ammonia. So if we are able to replace this dirtier hydrogen with green hydrogen, we get a very low carbon footprint, but it's still not zero. But if we apply carbon negative hydrogen, we're able to get a deeply carbon negative ammonia. Next, carbon negative hydrogen could also enable a circular carbon economy. I think this is really cool. For instance, biohydrogen made from municipal solid waste can turn into fuel that powers the city's transport system, and this would cut the city's overall transport-related emission by the overall emission. Biohydrogen could also play a role in reducing food production's overall emission. Ammonia and its derivative, nitrogen fertilizer, is essential to global food production. And if we can turn the crop leftovers, animal manures, and food waste, or any other organic waste collected from any point in the food supply chain to biohydrogen, and use that biohydrogen to make fertilizers, and then this fertilizer is, of course, applied to the agricultural activities, we can lower the food system's overall carbon impact. All right, so I talked a lot about what the carbon negative biohydrogen can do, but it still faces obstacles when it comes to scaling up. The first difficulty is that there are still barriers in its production technologies. For thermochemical pathways, there are issues with tar formation, there are issues with hydrogen cleanup from other byproducts, and there are issues with catalyst contamination. And certain thermochemical production processes can also emit air pollutants and toxins that can damage air and water. So making environmental concern something that's also important, that's essential. The second difficulty is biomass resource itself. Low carbon biomass resource such as waste is limited, and creating biohydrogen can compete with another existing use of this waste. For instance, Europe has been using waste to generate power and to produce biogas. And the next group of challenge is CO2 disposal. Because CCS is necessary in the process to create negative carbon footprint, biohydrogen's production must be able to access a place to discard and store this captured carbon safely. And however, this CO2 storage sites are not evenly distributed around the world. Moreover, biohydrogen production and use gets few policy incentives around the world. We have lately we have IRA in the States. That's really a game changer, but that's not the case for the rest of the countries in the world. Last but not the least, we need a better emission counting system for biohydrogen and bioenergy in general to avoid any potential malpractices. Finally, some recommendations. First, national hydrogen strategy and planning should include biohydrogen. Some planning mentions biohydrogen briefly, but its development has no quantifiable or definable goal. Second, as I mentioned in this presentation, biohydrogen made from waste with CCS can enable the hard-to-abate sector to accomplish profound and deep decarbonization, and we want to make sure that the industry and government acknowledge that. Third, a standardized, verifiable carbon accounting system is very much needed if we want to manage biomass procurement properly and prevent any potential carbon leakage or lead to any potential environmental damage from the use of this biomass. And overall, government incentives are needed to increase biohydrogen's production and consumption, to improve the waste management with waste management systems so we can collect more organic waste as raw materials. We also need incentives to improve biohydrogen's production technologies and to lower the capex, the equipment costs, and the feedstock costs, which will make biohydrogen more cost competitive against other sources of hydrogen. All right, that concludes my presentation due to the time constraint. This presentation was only able to cover the key points from the paper. If you want to learn more about this in detail, please refer to our report. And thank you all for your time and attention. And Sophie will take over for the following session.
Thank you very much, Yushan. And just to say that Fan has just put the link to the report in the chat because there was a request. So the report has been published more than a month ago. I would now like to turn to Doris because she's part of the team which is behind the BP Energy Outlook. And I was very interested to see that in the new BP Energy Outlook, which was published a few weeks ago, we have biogenics hydrogen. So Doris, the floor is yours, and I'm very interested in your comments and how you see the role of biohydrogen.
Yeah, thanks, Anso, and thanks for inviting me to be part of this webinar. Yushan is a hard act to follow. It was a really great presentation, and congratulations to all of you on the paper. I think it was really excellent and well researched and well structured. So yeah, I would like to use my time to talk about the role of biohydrogen and bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS in particular, in our energy outlook. And it was released at the end of January, as some of you might have seen. And I want to talk about this in the context of 4 different areas. One is other uses for bioenergy. The second is other ways to produce hydrogen. The third is other applications of CCS. And then the fourth is other means of carbon dioxide removal. So before I get into those 4, as many of you are aware, the Outlook uses 3 scenarios to explore the uncertainties associated with the energy transition out to 2050. We have 2 what-if scenarios called accelerated and net zero that explore how the energy system might evolve with deep decarbonization, 75% reduction in emissions in the case of accelerated and 95% in the case of net zero. We also have a new momentum scenario that looks at kind of a continuation of the trajectory that we're currently on. And this year's Outlook updated last year's with 2 key developments. One was the Russia-Ukraine war, and the other was the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act. So to get into my first area of all the different uses of bioenergy, in the Outlook, there's a shift from traditional to modern bioenergy. And as Yushan talked about, this includes modern solid biomass, such as wood pellets. It also includes biofuels and biomethane. And all of those together total about 65 exajoules in 2050. And that represents about 10% of total primary energy. And similar to your paper, this is used without any change in land use. And the vast majority is sourced from agricultural and forestry wastes and or residues and wastes that are accessible without any detrimental effects to their ecosystems. So solid biomass accounts for the largest growth in modern bioenergy, and it's used mainly in the power sector. And much of the remainder is used to help decarbonize these hard to abate processes, especially in cement and steelmaking. In net zero, around 13 exajoules of biomass is used with carbon capture and storage, or BECCS, by 2050, predominantly in the power and industry sectors. But we also have deployment in heat and in hydrogen. So around 4 exajoules is used to produce hydrogen. BECCS deployment starts in the 2030s, ramping up in the 2040s as negative emissions become more valued. And in terms of total CO2 captured from this, it reaches 1.3 gigatons per year by 2050, with over 400 million tons of this associated with hydrogen. The 1.3 gigatons per year represents around 20% of the total CCS deployment, which is around 6 gigatons per year by 2050. And around 15% of this is on process emissions from cement production, and the remainders from the use of natural gas and coal. So turning to other means to produce hydrogen. In our net zero scenario, we have a total of around 55 exajoules or 460 million tons per year of hydrogen in 2050. And it's used basically in applications that are difficult to electrify. So it's in transport, in industry, for feedstocks for refining and the production of ammonia and methanol, as well as other uses in power, heating, and buildings. So around 2/3 of this low carbon hydrogen is made from green hydrogen, and 30% is from blue hydrogen. But we do have 5% or around 3 exajoules from biohydrogen. And almost all of that is combined with CCS. So where's the SPECS deployment? It's in regions with good biomass and CO2 storage potential. It's important to have that overlap. And it's led by the US, but with smaller amounts in China, Europe, and Brazil. And I think your paper will cause us to maybe look in some other areas too that you pointed out in your paper. And so finally, for carbon dioxide removal, or CDR, the IPCC in its 6th assessment report stated that carbon dioxide removal is now unavoidable to counteract hard to abate residual emissions and achieve net zero greenhouse gas emissions. So this includes BECCS, natural climate solutions, and direct air capture with storage. So each type of CDR has advantages and disadvantages and has different characteristics in terms of cost, co-benefits like biodiversity, and permanence of CO2 storage. So because of these uncertainties, there's a wide range of outcomes in these scenarios, but all of them highlight the need for massive amounts of CDR in the tens to hundreds of gigatons cumulatively out to 2050. The median IPCC 1.5 degree scenario includes a rapid scale up of both NCS and BECCS, reaching over 7 gigatons of CO2 per year by 2050, with half of that BECCS and half of that NCS. So to summarize, biohydrogen plays an important role in our net zero scenario. It does compete for this limited amount of sustainable biomass. It provides a firm source of hydrogen alongside green and blue hydrogen, and when combined with CCS, provides a source of carbon dioxide removal. And as I said before, the paper is really excellent, provides a useful framework to evaluate biohydrogen. It includes really sensible recommendations for business and policymakers. And I think it's going to be a great reference for us as we look to do the next version of the Outlook next year. So thanks a lot, and I'll turn it back to you, Anso.
Thank you very much, Doris. It's very encouraging for us to see that our analysis is going to be used by people who are actually behind projects. But I would also be very interested in getting the feedback from Emmanuelle, because Emmanuelle is working for the International Renewable Energy Agency, and there is, of course, renewable, and we have been talking a lot about bio things, and also is a policy analyst. So what is the feedback from people who are looking more at the policy angle? Emmanuelle, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Well, actually, while looking at your report, I realized that some of the messages that float around hydrogen, yes, as was pointed out in one of the conclusions, many policies and strategies misses the opportunity to mention biohydrogen. This is a reasonable approach for policymakers that wants to use the technologies that they perceive as more mature. And the green and the blue hydrogen industries have made a lot of efforts in presenting themselves as ready to go, ready to reach the gigawatt scale in the next decade. It's not surprised and then these hydrogen strategies forget about this option. However, I think we have to remember is that even in a scenario, we foresee that there are going to be a need of 614 megatons of hydrogen, mostly for hard-to-abate sectors, for meaning steelmaking, cement, ammonia, methanol, and long-haul transportation. However, even if only 2/3 of this will be fully green, this will mean that we are going to need 5 terawatt of electrolyzers. Just to give you a sense of the challenge, that means to scale from today, that is only where we only have 300 megawatt of electrolyzers in place, and no experience whatsoever with the multi-megawatt or gigawatt scale electrolyzers. This may seem trivial, but actually electrolysis and the transport of hydrogen is a big unknown, is a big unknown, is a big white space. And it's actually interesting to read sometimes some of the technical challenges and issues that have been raised in the last few years with pilot projects. So biohydrogen is not that much far away from other technologies. If we consider the fact that green hydrogen is not, let's say, in the same position where now is solar photovoltaic or wind energy. There is a space for additional research, and there is a space also because it will decrease the effort needed by the green hydrogen industry, which also means reduce the power generation capacity. Actually, I would say that this is one of the main benefits of the research of alternative hydrogen productions, reducing the need for additional solar PV and wind energy that can instead be diverted for decarbonization of the power sector directly, for direct electrification. Another advantage that I can see from this is also decrease the need to achieve a perfect CCS carbon capture rate. Now, blue hydrogen could have a great space in the future, but to truly be carbon neutral, the carbon capture rate would have to rise to levels so far unforeseen, together with a methane leakage reduction, basically annulment, that again is still unforeseen. This is another advantage of the technologies that you presented, because being the CO2 of a biogenic source, a perfect CCS will not be a sort of necessary piece of the puzzle. So even in that case, the alternative hydrogen production provides quite some benefits, allowing for technology to exist, even if it will never achieve that level of carbon reduction that instead is possible with green hydrogen, in fact. So to conclude, I would say that for few countries there is the opportunity to include in their policy making the adoption of dedicated research, dedicated R&D for alternative hydrogen production, and honestly is one of the messages that we are going to share in the future as IRENA.
Looks like Anso is having some connection problems here.
Yeah.
So we'll wait.
Yeah, it looks like Anne-Sophie has a frozen screen for now, so I will just quickly kick on with some moderated discussions. Actually, it's arranged for me to answer the first questions, so I will just ask myself the question. Hopefully, I can answer it. So the first question would be, and also I will invite all of the panelists to come in and discuss why biohydrogen really deserve the position of taking its own category. Shouldn't we discuss about the different color schemes? For example, we've definitely mentioned green hydrogen, blue hydrogen, and now we're proposing biohydrogen as its own category. Shall we really do this way, and why biohydrogen really deserve our focus at this particular point? And my quick response to this would be that biohydrogen deserve a specific focus because it provides a specific opportunity. As we discussed, biohydrogen is currently the only way that we can currently produce very negative emission hydrogen that can help to for the hard to abate sectors such as iron, steel, and cement to go from low carbonization to decarbonization, even to net zero and net negative. So this is a unique opportunity. And specifically, biohydrogen also needs specific supports. That's directly related to the fact that biomass is not the same of the kind of energy source related to fossil fuels or renewable energies. Biomass is distributed as well, so it needs to collect, dry, process, storage of its own facilities. It needs the infrastructure of its own, and therefore we need to have specific support for biomass conversion to bioenergy to cover these costs and to answer the uncertainties of the LC and LUC analysis. This is also mentioned in Yushan's report, which is the main focus of the driver for doing this specific research. I would like to stop here and see if Anne-Sophie is back online and if we can continue discussion with her moderation.
Thank you very much, Fan. Apologies, my internet has decided to stop just for one very brief second, but I'm now back online, and I see that you have indeed answered the question about why biohydrogen is a category on its own. I mean, I would like to really focus on something that we have not really addressed so much and turn to you, Yushan, about the policy recommendations that we could really offer to governments. I mean, Doris mentioned that she was seeing some great potential in the United States, in Brazil, in Europe, in China. But, what can we do in order to have more focus on this specific type of hydrogen, which seems to be relatively absent of the conversation? I would like to ask you first, and then also turn to Emmanuel for the same question.
Well, I think one of the most amazing aspect, yet the most challenging aspect of biohydrogen, particularly biohydrogen made with CCS, is that it is a type of biofuel. It is a bioenergy because it's biomass based. It is a hydrogen. It also uses CCS. So I see that on the government level, there could be confusion when it comes to the classification of this fuel. What is it exactly? Is it a bioenergy or is it hydrogen? Currently, a lot of the management of different sort of source of fuels are separated. For example, under the Department of Energy, there is the Office of Carbon Management, and there's the Office for Biofuel, but biohydrogen is both. So which office should really manage this, right? So I think one of the intention for this report is to raise the discussion on how we can qualify or classify biohydrogen, particularly negative carbon biohydrogen made with CCS on a policy level. So that's one of the reasons we want to, start the discussion. Yeah.
Thank you. Emmanuel, what do you think?
That's a hard question, how to make, how to put biohydrogen in the map of policymakers. I dare to say that it's all about knowledge sharing. We can only produce policies about if we know what we're talking about. And this is actually the big issue of hydrogen. Actually, let me say one thing. While reading your report about biohydrogen, I was thinking, yeah, no, this seems very similar to the same identical barriers that the classical green hydrogen is facing, only on steroids. It's only worse. It's only more difficult because the sustainability criteria would be more difficult to establish. For biohydrogen. The alternative use of bioenergy are way more, there are a lot of ways to classify where to use bioenergy before thinking to use biohydrogen, and so on and so forth. And one issue we have seen with hydrogen, let's say a small barrier that actually is stopping the clogs a lot, is the fact that the policymakers cannot subsidize, cannot provide assistance, even in regulatory terms, for something that does not exist yet. And as I mentioned, we only have a few megawatt scale electrolyzers, and we are still studying them. And we still don't know a lot about them. And policymakers are very wary to provide subsidies and or funds, or even dedicating political capital, or use the brains of the ministerial people for developing policies for technology that is still unclear. And at the same time, we cannot have this technology going on unless there is some form of political support or some form of market demand. And market demand will not be because there is no definition of what green hydrogen or renewable hydrogen or low carbon hydrogen is. So this is a deadlock. We are in a situation where no one can move because we're still waiting for some additional information. I would dare to say that for technologies like the biohydrogen one, there is one small solution, which is the research. Is university, is public funding by governments, because there you have the opportunity to provide pilot demonstration projects at scale, at a small scale. You have the opportunity not to need a demand, a market, and well, there is the governmental the government interest to foster young brains. So that's a small step.
So could I add to that? Yeah, just on the points around green hydrogen and the different types of hydrogen. You know, in the U.S., the Inflation Reduction Act does have very favorable incentives for green hydrogen, the $3 per kilogram, and being able to stack it with you know, around $26 per megawatt hour for renewables as well. So, but the idea is that, you know, they are starting out at a very high cost, but, you know, eventually with scale up and manufacturing and modularization, the cost will come down over time. So, and I think for biohydrogen, the key is how negative emissions are valued, because that's the thing that's going to drive the adoption the most, because it is a pretty capital intensive way to produce hydrogen. And so the value is more in the negative emissions than it is in the hydrogen.
Yeah, you're right.
Exactly. I mean, first of all, I'm so thankful to the IRA for making it on the carbon intensity basis, but actually the negativeness of the emissions is absent, because, you know, it's between 0 and 0.45, but you are not valued even more if you are going into negative emissions. And I think maybe this is something which is missing in all the policy frameworks. There should be even more reward for something which is actually reducing your emissions. Sorry, Emmanuel, I was cutting you, but please go ahead.
No, I was just saying that many policymakers, many policies around the world just they are going to support the first hydrogen batches that are just good enough. 3.35, 2.20 kilogram per kilogram, and that's like the limit. So there is no incentive for now to achieve those negative emissions at a high cost. And you are right, that's a missed opportunity. But again, I am not expecting policymakers to support something they don't know it exists, or they don't know that how to actually evaluate.
Well, I think the EU is looking at a framework for carbon dioxide removal, and haven't heard the latest, but that could be a step towards, including it in compliance markets. So I think we're losing Anso again.
No worries. Please go on, Doris, if you have a comment.
I was going to say it's hard to talk and look at the questions too, because I know there's a lot of good questions in the chat, but and I think there's some on CCS that maybe bear some response to, because I think CCS is an area that is going to be really important for the world to get to net zero, and there like other things, it needs to be well regulated, but there's a lot of studies that are out there, and as well as demonstrated projects that show that it's safe and that it's permanently stored. So I think the IPCC even has a percentage. It's like extremely small chance of leakage. And in terms of the US, to get a Class 6 injection permit for CO2 storage, you have to go through a very rigorous permitting process, and it's designed to protect the drinking water. And it's been demonstrated for several years in saline formation in an ethanol plant, the ADM plant. So that's been going on for several years. So hopefully that helps to answer some of these questions about CCS and the safety and storage.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah, I think there was also a question on, the rapidness or the rapidity of deployment of CCS in general, and also a couple of questions on the capture rate. So do you think the IRA, for example, is going to be triggering more investment? Do you see more things happening, especially since you are based in Houston?
Yeah, absolutely. You've seen a lot more projects get announced, because the IRA increased the credit for CCUS from $50 a ton for storage and saline formation up to $85 a ton. So that just brings more applications into the money. It makes projects that are or applications where the CO2 is very easy to capture, like ethanol. There's a whole bunch of ethanol CCS projects being proposed, but also applications where the CO2 concentration is lower and you have to put in capture equipment. So I think you're going to start to see more applications in the US as a result of IRA.
There were also some questions about why we have not seen so many projects of biohydrogen. So maybe turning to you, Yushan, because across your research, you were screening to see which projects were happening. I mean, and maybe Emmanuel, you have also that on your radar screen. So what sort of projects did you see being considered over the past year or so, or even recently?
You mean with CCS or in general?
Biohydrogen in general, whether they are with CCS or not, but also to try to see, the gasification process, or maybe over with the pyrolysis that we were also asked about.
Yeah, honestly, I couldn't identify any project in such sense.
During the time when I was drafting the paper, there was a plant in California, in Lancaster, that was using, I think, waste papers and use that to manufacture hydrogen. Nowadays, I think there are a couple of plants I know they're under construction. They're set to be in operation in 2025 or 2026. One plant is by Mode Technology. Another one is called, I think, SR Raven, funded by Chevron. Those are the two plants that I know that are under construction. They aren't a lot. There are quite a few startups that I saw that uses, I guess, biological routes to make biohydrogen, but they're really far away from commercialization or building a plant. They're usually in research stage. The ones that I was talking about, were mainly using thermochemical routes such as gasification. Yeah.
So there were also a lot of questions on, we talked about the policy support, but is there a role also in terms of research and development, and who should take that role upon? And what is also the role of the private sector in trying to develop technologies which are almost inexistent? We can see that they have potential, but what can be done in order to try to move this technology, especially Yushan, you highlighted the different TRR and the fact that there is a valley of death in between 4 and 6.
I think I can quickly jump in over here. So we obviously see a very deep death valley between the TRL level between 4 and 6. That means the technologies regarding hydrogen production using biomass is either in the very early stage that is in research focus. So for those parts, it's majorly in universities and in research institutes that should be make more advancement according to prove the concept that these are the valid pathways to produce biohydrogen. On the other end, we already have the TRL level that's somewhere between 7 to 8 or 9. That means that it's already past the death valley. So more important thing in this range will be the private sectors to under certain kind of helps from government fundings, from collaborations with research institute to figure out what is the best way to build the prototype in large scale. Other than proving the concept, it's now to prove that it's commercially viable, is able to make money under certain policy schemes, under certain policy support, and etc. And the most important thing is to how to make the technologies before the death valley to cross the death valley. So in terms of this end, that means we are majorly looking at startup companies and research institutes to cooperate with government, etc., to prove the concept in the mid scale. For example, first of the kind prototypes and etc. So these are the things that government should really focus on to help the technologies to cross the death valley and help the commercialization part. So these will be the priority for the R&D perspective.
So, Doris, I would like to come back to something that you said. I mean, in your forecast, you mentioned that you saw the first development of biohydrogen in the 2030s, and then, really scaling up in the 2040s. So, what was really the key behind this relatively late development compared to other technologies? Was it really the technologies, the competitiveness, the issues around the feedstock, and maybe also the competitiveness of feedstock for biohydrogen, but maybe for also a lot of other applications, because we can use bioenergy for a lot of other things. And Emmanuel, I would like you also to intervene on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think it goes back to what we were talking about before around the costs of biohydrogen, and that the value is mostly in the negative emissions. So as you get closer and closer to 2050, then the negative emissions are more and more valued. And so that's when you start to see that value from biohydrogen come up. So that's really the reason for that, is just the increasing value of negative emissions as you get closer to 2050.
Emmanuel?
Well, for biohydrogen, I would say that the same discourse for green hydrogen exists. The discourse for green hydrogen is that the first uses, the best, the most added value is where hydrogen is currently used. Also because, correct me if I'm wrong, but the emissions are negative because we are not going to use a certain amount of hydrogen elsewhere, some form of gray or even black hydrogen. So the use of this biohydrogen for hard-to-abate sector is should be the priority. Even if it's on small quantities, should not go into some form of distributed generation that could be easily covered by electrification. In particular, should not go in residential heating, because for that bioenergy can do it much more easily.
Yes, indeed. I mean, I think we need also to make sure politicians really understand what is the best use of hydrogen, especially when it makes more sense to have electrification first, and probably the same would also apply for the different uses of bioenergy. Fan, I would like to turn to you for maybe one of the last questions on the development of infrastructure, and what would be actually, the best way to make one of these technology move forward? What is the easiest or the least expensive way to actually move forward one of those technologies?
Yes, that's an excellent question. It's actually brought up in the Q&A session as well, is that probably we can integrate biohydrogen projects into one of the existing low carbon hub projects in the United States or around the globe. For example, we now have a proposed low carbon hub in Texas, in Houston regions. So they're proposing an integrated system with infrastructure support for CO2 capture and storage. So they will build up, for example, pipeline and storage facilities that is directly can be used for gasification, CCS, using biomass feedstocks. And also they're building this hub of hydrogen utilization centers that there will be a lot of consumers in this region. Only thing that is needed is for some biomass gathering and collection facilities. Well, fortunately, Texas is also a big agriculture state. So taking advantage of its existing infrastructure, integrate biohydrogen projects and biohydrogen development goals into the big scope of hydrogen economy and low carbon hub projects will be a very good point to start building a scaled projects for initialization. So this will be the probably the short-term focus and the short-term opportunity for large-scale deployment.
Thank you very much. I would like to give each of our three other panelists the opportunity to give a few last words. So starting with Yushan, then Emmanuel and Doris. Yushan?
Yeah, I think I just want to say that overall, biohydrogen is not going to be as widely accessible as green or blue hydrogen. It will be a niche product in small quantities, targeting a specific group of customers that really run out of options to decarbonize their production. Biohydrogen also has quite limited supply, raw material supply, because it requires the use of waste if you want to, produce carbon negative hydrogen. So, and waste itself, it will be a valuable resource going forward. So it's important that we understand that, like, we're not really competing the use of biohydrogen with against other sources of hydrogen. It's unique, and it will be its own. It will have its own market.
Emmanuel?
To conclude, as I mentioned, we only have around 30 years to save ourselves from the climate catastrophe. We already have most of the technologies that we need, and the material and the knowledge and even the policies. But that's not enough. We need to achieve those last percentage points. And for doing that, innovation is still needed. Innovation like biohydrogen that could help easing the burden of blue and green industry. So research and development on this field are needed alongside with all the other innovation technologies that are needed to finalize the energy transition.
Thank you. Doris?
Yeah, I agree with both of those comments. And I think, really it's sort of an all of the above approach that's needed here. All of these tools and different ways of getting, negative emissions and hydrogens, they all have, I think what we like to say is there's no silver bullet. So all of these different solutions are going to be needed. So thank you again for bringing attention to biohydrogen, because like you said, hasn't gotten enough attention. So Thanks again.
Indeed. And this is a very good conclusion. There is no silver bullet. We need all kinds of solutions. So I would like to thank again our speakers for joining us today. And thanks for our audience for tuning in and for sending so many questions. I'm afraid that we have not managed to answer all of them, but you can reach out to us on LinkedIn or through the website. We would be more than happy to answer additional questions. As we have mentioned, the full video recording of the event will be available on the Center on Global Energy's website in a few days. For a full calendar of the upcoming event, you can also visit our website, and we hope that you are going to enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you soon. And as we mentioned also, the report that we published is available also on our website under the category hydrogen. Thank you very much to all of you.
Thank you.